Hey guys, welcome to Drawing with Abby. In today's video, we're going to be doing an illustration of Catwoman on my Ultra device in Infinite Painter. This isn't an app I've spent a whole lot of time drawing in, so I'm going to be exploring different options as we draw along. That said, let's go. So a quick thing to note here is that I'm using the time-lapse feature that's built into Painter. And one of the drawbacks of that is that unfortunately, we're not going to be able to see any of the menu options that I'm using as I'm drawing. So seeing things like what brush I'm selecting or what sizes I'm using or adjustments, unfortunately, that wasn't captured in the time-lapse, which kind of sucks. I think the time-lapse feature is actually pretty interesting, especially when you're creating art and you plan to share it on Instagram, or if you want to post it on TikTok. Being able to draw without thinking about recording and then being able to have access to recording of your drawing is tremendous. And there's a lot of tools that Painter builds right into the application. So I do plan to do a video later on about that. So speaking of brushes, I've been messing around with Painter, and there's a couple of brushes that I actually like using for sketching. So the first is the marker sketch brush. I usually grab that at the beginning of the drawing to quickly block out my shapes and block out the pose. And then I'll do a light erase with an airbrush brush with the eraser tool. And I will use the soft pen tool under the pen presets for sketching. And the reason why I use that one is because it is the brush out of the entire brush selection that's available in Painter. That is most like the brush tool, the soft round brush tool found in Photoshop. And it's a brush I really like using when I first started doing digital art. That's the one I would use all the time. And every time I jump into a new application, I try to find a brush as similar to that as much as possible, for the sketching especially, or I'll try to import a brush to make that work. Now, which brings me to my first point about Painter. With Painter, you're dealing with a very different brush engine than what most applications use. Clip Studio and Photoshop essentially use the same type of brush engine, whereas Painter uses its own custom proprietary brush engine. And there's some benefits and drawbacks with that. A great benefit is that the tilt sensitivity on their brushes is just way better than what I've seen on other applications. Tilt sensitivity is something that Photoshop and Clip Studio Paint have added over the years, whereas Painter, from the get-go, they've kind of built that into all of their brushes. So I do notice I get dramatically better tilt output out of the brushes, especially when you're dealing with the pencil brushes. If you're drawing on the side of your pen, you're getting a much broader stroke versus drawing with the tip, and you really feel that throughout the entire experience. However, I'm not super crazy about the pencil brushes that Painter has, and that's just a taste issue. They're solid brushes, it's just I really don't feel comfortable drawing or sketching in them. I always feel like I'm fighting those brushes rather than, the lines coming easily to me. So that's more of a preference thing. One of the downsides of their unique brush engine is the fact that you cannot import any of the brushes that you have in Clip Studio Paint or Photoshop. So that entire library of brushes that you've collected over time, they just won't work here. It does have a custom brush creator, so you can spend some time messing around in there and see if you can come up with a brush that's as close as to what you're looking for. But in terms of importing brushes that you already have, unfortunately you can't do that. So here you can see in the drawing, I started off with a blue color on one layer, and then I've created a new layer once I've sort of blocked out my shape and my basic anatomy. And with this new layer, I'm refining that by using a different color, same type of brush. I'm using a soft pen brush, and going ahead to adding some shading, refining my lines, just making things look a little bit more solid. Sometimes I skip this step and I go straight into inking, but because I'm using this application for the first time and I'm not really familiar with the inking brushes, I wanted to define everything in the sketch stage before I got to the inking brushes. Speaking of the inking brushes, I'm using primarily the Manga inker under the pen brush set. This one has great thick and thin. And it has a great look to it, so I kind of love using it. The only problem that I have with this particular brush, and I still need to sort of dive into the settings to see if there's any adjustments I can make here, is that the application of thick to thin can be all over the place a little bit. Sometimes I'm playing what I think is medium amount of pressure, and I'm getting too much pen output from the brush, meaning that the lines are a lot more thicker than I intended them to be. So when I'm drawing very lightly, what I find is that it has a very low activation point. So I'm trying to, do some light brushy lines and it's not registering on the screen. It's not as dramatic as as you would imagine it. I'm describing it. It is something I just noticed, and compared to like Clip Studio or Photoshop or Artflow, I do notice a big difference. But that said, out of all the brushes that they have available for inking, this one is definitely by far has the best look and feel, and that is because of that thick and thin. You do get a lot of variation out of it. And one of the side benefits of the thick and thin working the way that it does by applying a lot of thickness or maybe a little too little thickness, depending on the pressure that you're applying, is that it does give it a kind of a naturalistic look to the lines, which is a nice side benefit. But again, I still need to play around with the settings, adjust the sensitivity for the brush, and try to get the best possible look out of it. And that's one nice benefit that the application has, is that you can adjust the pressure curves and the tilt curves for each of the brushes individually, which is really nice. So you can see for Catwoman, what I'm doing is I've went ahead and created a new layer on top of my ink layer. And I've selected sort of the areas I knew are going to be 100% pure black, and I filled them in with the paint bucket tool. And then what I'm doing is, rather than building from dark to light, I'm working from light to dark. And what that means is that I'm starting with the pure blacks, and then I'm using my eraser tool and using a variety of different brushes. So I'm exploring a lot of different brushes right now, as you can see. And I'm using those to sort of define the highlights and define the shapes, rather than using black inks to do that. So some of the brushes that I've been experimenting here and I've been liking is the halftone brush. So this one creates sort of a nice soft shading effect, especially when you're working from light to dark. And the dry brush offers a nice textured look when I'm working against those blacks. I'm able to create sort of a matte, shiny look on the leather, which was really nice. And then for the hair, I went back to the Manga inking brush, and as you can see here, I'm zooming in and adding some fine detail. With the Manga inking brush, what I do is I'll switch up the brush size a lot, and this sort of combats and minimizes sort of that thick and thin issue I was struggling with. Working with a really small brush size, I'm talking like 3 pixels, maybe 4 pixels, sometimes even drop down to like 2.5 pixels. That I found I was able to get some nice textured look out of that particular pen. And which is another great thing, is that this pen, the pen settings allows you to drop down into decimal points for the brush sizes, which is cool. So that's something I really see in a whole lot of applications. So it's really cool to see here. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how the illustration turned out, especially considering I don't really draw in this application too often. I do plan on making a full review of Infinite Painter, and I'll share my full thoughts on it. But overall, pretty happy with this experience. And there's my illustration of Catwoman. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any questions about Painter or the Ultra device or anything that you saw me do in the drawing, leave a question in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button. If you want to see more, hit that subs button. And as always, keep drawing.